Hello, you are welcome to this lecture, session 6 of Unit 4. And in this session, we'll be looking at internal audit as a control factor. Internal audit as a control factor. Now, this is the last session of Unit 4. Unit 4 as a whole is talking on internal control systems. Internal control systems. And here we are looking at the internal control or the internal audit as a control factor. At the end of this session, you should be able to outline the scope of internal auditing, describe the internal auditor's role in the risk management, and describe the functional relationship between the internal auditors and the external auditor. You have to also outline the preliminary assessment of the internal auditing required for reliance by the external auditor, and then outline the requisite guidance for successful internal control. So these are the objectives that must be achieved at the end of the lecture. Now, why the need for internal audit department? Why the need for internal audit department? Now, with the growth in size and complexity of many companies in the recent years, it is important for internal auditing to be established, and internal auditing has correspondingly increased so that today it will become a major factor, or it has become a major factor in establishing the quality of a company's internal control. Now, some of the need for internal audit are as follows. So any trends or current factors relevant to the company's activities, its market, or other aspects of its external environment that have increased risks. So if the business are expanding because of their complexity, there is a need for the internal audit department to be established to assess and reduce these risks to the minimum level. Now we have internal factors such as the organizational restructuring or changes in reporting processes or any underlying information system. So whilst these are changing, they are presenting some sort of complexities, and then the internal audit has to be undertaken to reduce the risks associated with these complexities. Now, another reason why we need it because there are some adverse trends events from the monitoring of internal control systems. We have increased incidence of unexpected occurrences, which are some contributing factors why there is a need for internal audit department to be established. Now let's look at internal audit. What we mean by internal audit. Now, internal audit means an appraisal activity established within an entity as a service to the entity. So it's an appraisal activity established within that particular entity to render service to that particular entity. And its functions include, among other things, monitoring internal control. So they have to monitor internal control. Now, this internal audit is an independent appraisal or monitoring activity which has been established by management and directors, or the review of the accounting and internal control system as a service to the entity. And we have just explained some of its core functions that they must perform. Now we have the external auditor also there. So the external auditor should as well consider the activities of the internal auditing and their effect, if any, on its external audit procedures. So in a way, the external auditor is coming to rely on the internal audit. So you should assess their activities to see whether you can rely and make use of some of their activities or findings. Now, when we look at this definition of internal control, we could see that there are several aspects to this definition. There are several aspects to it. So one thing we have identified that it is an internal auditing, and this internal auditing is an appraisal system, and this system or the audit is established by management as a service to the entity. So the internal auditor is an employee to the entity. So it involves the review of the accounting systems. So you are looking at the review of the accounting system. Now it also involves the review of accounting system, as I said, and the review of internal control systems, which are systems of financial control, operational control, and the compliance control. So these are some of the or some essential items we can draw from the definition of internal audit. So let's look at the scope and objective of internal audit. The scope and objective of internal auditing. Now, the scope and objective of internal auditing vary widely and depend on the size and nature of the entity and the requirements of its management. So, depending upon your size and then the requirement by management, that would determine the scope and objective. But ordinarily, internal audit activities include one or more of the following. So the monitoring of internal control, examination of the financial and operating information, the review of the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of operations, including the non-financial controls of the entity. So these are some of the things that the scope and then the objectives of the internal auditing deals with. Let's look at some limitations of the internal audit function. Limitations of internal audit function. Now we're basically saying that internal audit should be an independent and objective function. However, this independence can be compromised, particularly where reporting lines are through to operational areas which they are required to review and report on them. So for this reason, it's going to impede the process, and we have some variations in the standard as one of the limitations. So if we look at the independence, which I've just explained, then we take the variation of standards. When it comes to the variation of the standard, we basically say that the approaches to internal audit vary significantly across the industry. So while some are moving to a more consultancy type approach, others continue to perform a stick and check approach. So that is the variation when it comes to the standard. Now, another limitations of the internal audit function is the relatively new profession. And when we talk about the relatively new profession, the internal audit is still relatively new profession, which has been changing significantly over the years. So for this reason, a wide variety of backgrounds are attracted into the internal audit function. Now, another limitation is the expectation gap. The expectation gap. And then there is a balance to be achieved between added value work and then the check-in work, and the potential skills and expectations gap between the consultancy and compliance. Now, the last limitation we'll look at is the understanding of the internal audit. Understanding of the internal audit. Basically, there is generally poor understanding of the functions of the internal audit. It is still seen as a negative policy activity, checking for compliance and co. And there is therefore a significant education exercise for internal auditors within an institution to aid understanding of risk control and internal auditing. So people still don't get why there should be an internal audit. So there has to be a massive education on the internal auditors and what is required of them to do. So let's now look at the relationship between internal audit and external audit. Relationship between internal audit and external audit. Now the role of the internal auditor is determined by management, and this objective or his objective differ from those of the external auditor, who is appointed to report independently on the financial statement. The internal auditor's function vary, or its objective varied according to management requirements, and the external auditor's primary concern is whether the financial statements are free from material misstatement. This is their concern, and this is what they are looking for to give an opinion. So when we want to look at these advantages or the difference, when you look at the external auditor, it has to give opinion on account if it is true and fair, but the internal auditor has to review or perform a review of the accounting and internal control system and value for money. The external auditor reports to shareholders, members, and management. Then um, the internal auditor has to report to management and directors. External auditor reports to shareholders or members. My internal auditor has to report to management or the director. Now, the external auditor is independent. He or she is external to the company, but the internal auditor is an employee of the company that is contracted by the company. The external auditor is a qualified member of a recognized profession, but with the internal auditor, there is no formal qualification required to be able to do that. So these are some of the difference or relationship between the external auditor and then the internal audit and then the external audit. Now, understanding and preliminary assessment of internal auditing. Understanding and preliminary assessment of the external audit. Now, the external auditor's assessment of the internal auditor's function will influence the external auditor's judgment about the use which may be made of the internal auditing in making risk assessment and thereby modifying the nature, the timing, and the extent of the external audit procedures. So the external auditor might want to rely on the internal audit function to arrive at its conclusions, and before he can rely on it, he has to use the auditor's judgment to see if the controls are effectively in place before he can rely on these procedures and then carried out by the internal audit function. Now, the auditor should, or the external auditor should, try and obtain a sufficient understanding of the internal audit activities to identify and assess the risk of material misstatement of the financial statement and to design and perform further audit procedures. And in that manner, there has to be an effective internal auditing, which will often allow a modification in the nature and timing and a reduction in the extent of audit procedures performed by the external auditor, but cannot eliminate them entirely. So he has to look for this, a way to reduce this. Now, as part of understanding the preliminary assessment of the internal auditing, this must be understood. We have to look at the organizational status, and with this we look at the specific status of the internal audit in the entity and the effect this has on its ability to be objective. Then we look at the scope of its function or the scope of function. Here we have to look at the nature and the extent of internal auditing assignment performed, the nature and extent of the assignment that is performed. Then with the technical competence, you look whether the internal auditing is performed by persons having adequate technical training and proficiency in internal auditors. So do they have this training and proficiency as internal auditors to perform this role? Then we come to the last thing that must be looked at, which is the due professional care. With a due professional care, you assess whether internal auditing is properly planned, supervised, reviewed, and documented. And then the existence of this adequate audit manual, the work program, and then the working papers would be considered in looking at the due professional care. So these are some four preliminary assessments of internal control that must be made: organizational status, the scope of function, technical competence, due professional care. Now let's look at the guidance for internal auditors. Guidance for internal auditors. It says there should be a guide on the independence of the internal auditor. There should be some staff training. Training platform should be organized so that the auditor can be equipped with the necessary skills and competence in doing the work. You have to look at the relationship between management and the auditor, management and the auditor, and then the external auditors as well. And the due care must be taken. There has to be some planning and control and recording of whatever review that has been performed. After that, there has to be some evaluation of the internal control system to see if they are working effectively, if they are working to achieve the objective. Then you have to also look for evidence. After reviewing it, there must be some sort of evidence gathered, and based on the evidence, a report on the internal control system must be presented to management. Now, there could be a possibility where an entity will decide to outsource the function of the internal audit. They might not see the need why they should have internal audit as part of it of the organization, but rather outsource it. And this is what is happening in many years or in recent time, as entities have developed a system of outsourcing their internal audit function to a professional audit firm. So they will engage the services of another audit firm or a professional firm to come and do their internal audit for them, instead of having their own internal audit department unit. And this comes with certain risks and benefits as well. So what then become the reason why entities have to outsource the internal audit function? The reason being that sometimes it can be expensive to maintain the internal audit functioning, which consisting of employees of the company. And then it is also possible that a number of internal audit staff are required, but the cost of recruitment is prohibitive, or the directors are aware that the need for the internal audit is only for a short term. So for this reason, they might decide to outsource the audit internal audit function. As I said, this comes with some advantages and disadvantages. Now, with the advantages, we are saying that the professional audit firm are likely to have more qualified and experienced staff. So if you go for a professional staff, you or firm, you consider that their staff are well competent and qualified. Then the professional audit firm can be engaged on a continuing basis, or as and when their services are required in response to the dictate of the entity's requirements and circumstances. Now, we are basically also saying that the independence of the professional audit firm can be more demonstrable than the staff of an entity. So that staff own entities internal audit department. So in the sense that a professional audit firm cannot be influenced or swayed by management. So there is some kind of independence there. Then the professional audit firm is also responsible for its activities, which can sue and be sued, and for that matter, carries an insurance. So it provides some kind of guarantee there. Now, the professional firms also bring to bear on internal audit function ethical standards that characterize its professional body. So, with the outsourcing, the firm that is coming has certain standard that guides their activities, especially when it comes to auditing. So they have to apply this, which is an added benefit. The people already have the knowledge and then the skills to be able to um, render the service to the client. Now, what are the disadvantages associated with this? You have to look at the cost to the company. So you going to outsource the internal audit uh, activities or function from a professional body. It's come with cost. Then there could be some limited knowledge of specific entity. So if the entity you are going in, they don't have the knowledge of the area you want them to come and do, there could be a limitations to that. Then you have to also look at the independence issues if external auditors provide the internal audit function. So if the external auditor is now coming to perform the internal audit function, and his independence will be questionable here, in the sense that he doubles as the internal auditor and external auditor. So there could be some threats to the fundamental principles as well here. So in summary, we have looked at internal auditing, its scope and objective. We look at the relationship between the internal auditor and the external auditor, and the requisite guidance for successful internal auditing. So basically, when we talk about um, internal, or when we look at the internal audit function, this is what it basically does. Let's try to read the book, read the manual to enhance your understanding of this. Thank you and see you in the next lecture.